Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. For this video, I'm going to be ranking the games in the main series and tactics based upon how good their villains are. I'm going to mostly base my rankings on the main villains in each game. In the case of a more ensemble villain cast, I'll try to factor that in and give appropriate consideration to minor villains that leave a big impact in case of any close calls. But in general, the ranking is based on the quote-unquote big bad from each game. Not necessarily the final boss, but who I would consider the main overarching villain of the plot. That said, this does offer me a chance to talk about other interesting villains from the games as well. For the MMOs, I'm only going to be looking at the base game to make it more of an even playing field, so sorry in advance, Emmett Selk fans. I suspect that will cause a bit of controversy, so I might end up revisiting this ranking at some point in the future with expansion villains considered. But for now, to keep it fair, we're just looking at the villains in the base games. Oh, and this video will contain spoilers. If you don't want spoilers for a particular game, skip that section. You have been warned. Alright, let's get into the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy XIII. One of the biggest weaknesses in the story of Final Fantasy XIII is the main villain, Daisley. He's basically an evil pope and is secretly a fal'Cie called Barthandelus, trying to cause massive death to convince his mother god to return to her abandoned children. He wants the party to destroy him, which will bring about the end of Cocoon. It is their fate and destiny. Our hero's solution to the problem is to fight fate by fighting Barthandelus, which is what he wants. The problem with this villain is that his plan is a bit muddled and confusing. That wouldn't be so bad if he wasn't also so incredibly uninterested in terms of personality. While he does offer some pretty cool boss fights in terms of visuals, music, and epic difficulty, he's just not an interesting threat, and is one of the few examples where I agree with the critics of 13. His part of the story is really muddled, and because of the generally weak writing around his character, 13 takes last place in the ranking. Number 15, Final Fantasy XII. Vayne Salvador is often considered one of the better parts of Final Fantasy XII, and while I like his design, I find him to be rather bland and boring. There's not really anything distinct about him. I get that he's supposed to be more of a conniving political threat, the genius head of state always one step ahead of our heroes, but I didn't find his actions to be clever enough for me to really buy it, and he never really landed with me as a villain personally, despite his luscious locks and great voice acting. It's clear that the core of Vayne was an attempt at a villain more in the vein, pun unintended, of other antagonists that Matsuno had written in his other works. But without Matsuno to guide the story, Vayne ends up lacking the nuance he needs to be compelling. Him turning into the Incredible Hulk at the end was kind of fun though. Number 14, Final Fantasy III. First off, the Cloud of Darkness is a very cool final boss. I love the design and the boss music is absolutely fantastic. Conceptually and narratively, I like the Cloud of Darkness as well. But the Cloud of Darkness is more of the classic final boss switcheroo that Final Fantasy games like to do, and Xande feels more like the main villain for a bigger chunk of the game. I really like Xande, or Xande, however you choose to pronounce his name, both in terms of visual design and concept. You could see why Xande would be furious about the gift his master Noah gave him. The great sage Noah had 3 disciples. One gained knowledge of all magic. The other gained the ability to control the dream realm. And Xande's gift was mortality. What a crappy gift. Congrats, you get to die. Wow, how thoughtful. Of course Xande was pissed about that. While one can argue death is what gives life meaning, it feels more like a coping mechanism for humans not wanting to face the horror of the cessation of existence, and Xande's rage at such a gift is warranted. His efforts to freeze time to stave off his inevitable demise is something all humans can relate to. It's a far more interesting concept than Daisley or Vayne, which is why he ranks above them, but he doesn't really get much screen time or have much personality when you meet him, and thus the villains of Final Fantasy III can't be ranked any higher. Number 13, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Sorry MX Selk fans. I hear he's a great character. When I finally beat the 14 expansions, I may do some informal videos on my thoughts if you guys are interested. But again, this ranking is only looking at the base game, which means A Realm Reborn. The main villain in A Realm Reborn is arguably Gaius, who has a very cool design, very cool voice, and very generic personality. You see enough of him where he feels like a credible threat, and he has a level of intimidation about him, but that's about it. He's not that great, at least in A Realm Reborn, but he's a bit more fun to watch than those below him on the list. He certainly has screen presence and steals the scene whenever he's around. While in concept he's less interesting than Xand in the Cloud of Darkness, he has the distinct advantage of being on screen more than once, and is significantly less boring than Vayne and Daisley. I don't have too much to say about him, other than that he's a serviceable villain in 14's base game. Not great, but not out and out bad either. Number 12, Final Fantasy V. When it comes to villains, Final Fantasy V has two that are really worth mentioning. One is Exdeath, the main villain of the game, who feels less like a Final Fantasy villain and more like a Super Nintendo villain. It's not necessarily a bad thing. He's extremely campy, silly, and over the top. Exdeath is basically just an evil tree that wants to destroy stuff because he's just so gosh darn bad. That's it. He's a 60s Batman villain. He's fun and has about as much depth as a puddle. Everything about him is surface level. And then there's his subordinate Gilgamesh, a bumbling comic relief henchman with a great character design and fantastic character theme. He's goofy and aloof, like a less competent Team Rocket, but even he has his limits, and he eventually decides that being evil isn't his thing anymore and begins a journey of dimension hopping. Both Exdeath and Gilgamesh are really fun villains that are a blast to have on screen, but you never really take either of them seriously. Number 11, Final Fantasy Tactics. This is probably a hot take ranking the villains of Final Fantasy Tactics so low on this list. Final Fantasy Tactics is more of an ensemble villain piece than any one particular villain really stealing the show from main villain status, at least for the majority of the game. And since this ranking is based mostly off main villains, that's why it ranks as low as it does. Final Fantasy Tactics is more about competing factions with different schemes and their machinations for power, similar to Game of Thrones. Both stories are inspired by the real-life War of the Roses, so it makes sense the stories would have some thematic similarities. If you had to pin down a main villain in Tactics, it would be Ultima, a demon that is summoned unto the world through massive bloodshed, so in a way the villain plot is similar to 13's, but executed far better here, pun not intended. Hundreds of years prior to the events of Tactics, Ultima possessed a human known as Saint Ajora, that world's equivalent of Jesus Christ. And while he is remembered as a messianic figure in that world's history, Saint Ajora is arguably the main villain, and in the past was defeated by Germanique, that world's equivalent to Judas. So, in Tactics, Judas is a hero and Jesus is the bad guy. Ah, 90s JRPGs, gotta love them. I actually find the twist on the Christ story to be pretty clever storytelling, and it ties in well to the game's themes of corruption, of history, and bearing the truth. But when people praise the villains of Tactics, they're typically talking about the more human characters, and there are some great ones. Argoth, Wygraf, Delita, Marquis Elmdor, Duke Baratin, and Dicestarg are all great villains. Argoth and Delita are painful because you initially like the characters, and seeing their darker side hurts like a punch to the gut. Wygraf is the kind of villain you respect for his morality and sense of justice, but he is ultimately a pawn in the grander schemes. Marquis Elmdor offers one of the most sophisticated threats in the game, and feels like the kind of villain 12 wanted Vayne to be. Dicestarg's many betrayals make him infuriating in a way you want a villain to be. And Duke Baratin. There are few individuals in gaming history that inspire as much hate as him, making his defeat all the more satisfying. Tactics may lack a focused big bad like the other games in the series, but that was never really the point. It was all about the combination of smaller villains and their greed adding up to the evil of the world. It's far more realistic in that way, but when ranking villains, it lacks the clear focal point that so many of the other games have. Tactics set out a different goal, and it succeeded extremely well, but if I'm primarily basing my ranking on the main villains of each game, this is as far as I can rank it. The game has a lot of great villains, but none of them have that edge that made them feel iconic. Number 10, Final Fantasy I. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Garland/Chaos from Final Fantasy I. Where Tactics is complex, layered, and nuanced, Final Fantasy I's villain is more simple, or as simple as Final Fantasy can be. Rather, his motivations are simple. He just wants more power and is willing to let the world, and himself, succumb to darkness in order to obtain it. "I, Garland, will knock you all down" is an iconic quote in gaming history. The plot twist of him sending the four fiends and himself through time, creating the time loop and becoming Chaos, is actually pretty fun. His design, both as Garland and as Chaos, is striking. He's simple and visceral, but his simplicity is what makes him such a great villain. It evokes the purest and most primal stories of good and evil in our hearts. He's bad, we are good, and we have to stop him. He's the villainous knight, and we are the noble heroes. There's a charm to his manner of speech and the convolution of his time loop, and the striking nature of his design that makes him a very satisfying villain. The fact that the first boss is ultimately the last boss feels like poetry. It rhymes, as George Lucas would say. Garland/Chaos is complemented wonderfully by the four fiends, but this is his show and he steals it. The fact that Garland/Chaos has endured to this day shows the strength of him as a villain. He may be simple, but he has endured for a reason. He's one of the best parts of Final Fantasy I, easily. Number 9. Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII's villain, Ultimecia, is a powerful driving force for her game's story. Her presence can be felt as far back as Disc 1 when she was possessing another sorceress, Edea. Whether or not she's in her original body or not, going by the name Edea or Ultimecia, she's still the same character with effectively the same power set. It's even possible that the body she's in at the end of the game might not be her own, and is just another body she is possessing. It doesn't matter what name she goes by, she is the main villain throughout the entire game, and it's not a villain fake-out like in other Final Fantasy games. She's been manipulating events in order to bring out time compression, which itself is an interesting concept, and she has a ton of charisma on screen. I'll admit to not being a fan of her newfound accent at the end of the game, as it seems a bit weird she doesn't have that accent when possessing anybody else, but that's a minor nitpick. Overall, she's a very captivating villain. Her continual presence throughout the game and atmosphere she carries with her helps propel her to the top 10 on this list. Also, her house is really, really cool. Number 8. Final Fantasy IV. While the main villain of Final Fantasy IV is ultimately Zemus, for most of the game we see his machinations through the actions of a brainwashed Golbez. Golbez, as brainwashed by Zemus, is effectively in the same villain situation as Edea and Ultimecia, where he is effectively just a vessel for the will and personality of the true villain. So while Edea and Golbez might be individual characters with their own autonomy when they aren't under mind control, when they are under control, it's more sensible just to think of them as the villains who are possessing them. When Captain Ginyu is in Goku's body, you don't think of him as Goku, right? Same concept here, though it's admittedly muddier in Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VIII than in Dragon Ball Z. Golbez is a great Darth Vader-style villain, continually showing his strength and acting as an intimidating force to propel the characters and narrative forward. His subordinates, including the Four Fiends and brainwashed characters like Kain and Yang, are great compliments to him. The brainwashing of Kain and Yang also serve as great foreshadowing to the reveal of Golbez's brainwashing. The fact that Golbez was a brainwashed puppet does hurt his villain status in the rankings, because when the player actually meets Zemus, he has far less personality than his brainwashed subordinates, and he does feel like he came from out of nowhere. Ultimecia, to her credit, was largely the same in all her incarnations, minus accents, and the build-up to her felt very natural. That said, the concept of the final boss being a manifestation of Zemus's undying hatred is really cool, and add that with a killer design and awesome music, mwah! Chef's kiss. In the end, Golbez/Zemus is a flawed villain, but the strength of Golbez's appearances throughout the game before the brainwashing reveal and the epic final boss battle is enough to secure him the number 8 spot on this list. Number 7. Final Fantasy II. I have an affinity for Final Fantasy II's main villain, Emperor Mateus. I just find him to be really cool and compelling. He's one of the more popular villains among Japanese fans, and I can see why. He's like a mixture of David Bowie's character from Labyrinth and Emperor Palpatine. Super powerful, super evil, but also charming, calm, and confident. He doesn't cackle, no, he's just so confident that nobody could possibly pose a threat to his almighty power, and that swagger is captivating. His greatest accomplishment is one of the most underrated villain moves in the series. After he died, his spirit split into two. One half went to heaven, and the other half went to hell. Both halves usurped and killed the rulers of their respective afterlife realms, meaning Mateus killed God in heaven and Satan in hell, and became ruler of the entirety of the afterlife. In order to stop him, the heroes had to descend into the depths of hell, while simultaneously a party of deceased heroes went into heaven to stop Mateus' other half, because the only way to defeat Mateus once and for all was to destroy his soul in both realms. That is so freaking metal! Mateus is easily one of the coolest villains in the series and is super underrated. Number 6. Final Fantasy XI. For the purpose of this ranking, I'm only looking at base 11, which means we're basically just looking at the Shadow Lord. The entire base game of 11 revolves around the Beastmen trying to revive him, and design-wise, he seems like your average Final Fantasy villain, not any more or less interesting than any other antagonist in the series. But where he really shines is his backstory, which is told really well, even in base 11. He's actually the best developed character in base 11 by a pretty significant margin. The Shadow Lord was once known as Raugrim the Tailkeeper. The members of the Galka race are reincarnated rather than giving birth to new generations, but when Galka are reborn they lose memories of their past life. The Tailkeeper is responsible for holding all the memories of their people and sharing lost memories with those who seek it. Raugrim found himself involved in the politics of his day, trying to help the people of his race receive more equality and less discrimination, in addition to trying to solve other problems of the day. While on an expedition to the north, Raugrim was betrayed by one of his comrades who didn't like his close relationship with a human female, and the traitor ended up slaying both Raugrim and his female companion, Cornelia. Ralgrim's hatred allowed him to be reborn as the Shadow Lord, and after exacting revenge on all of the expedition members, he gathered armies of beastmen to conquer Vana'diel. He was slain again, but years later his disciples sought to revive him. It's then up to the player hero to stop the Shadow Lord before another brutal war breaks out, and in the process of battling the Shadow Lord, his tortured soul is finally healed and able to find some semblance of peace. The Shadow Lord from Final Fantasy XI is a great villain with a tragic past. Like Ultimecia, he's got a pretty cool house and offers a great final boss fight. He's a fantastic Final Fantasy villain, sadly often forgotten because of how many people skip 11. Number 5, Final Fantasy IX. Okay, let's talk about the minor villains before we move on to the big bad. Queen Braun is a great early game villain with a striking design that captures the essence of the greedy aristocracy so well it almost feels like a living effigy. Soul Cage is a fascinating villain full of interesting lore that is rife for fan speculation. Beatrix is a force of nature as a villain, and her turn from villain to hero is great. Garland is a good counterbalance to our big bad, and for a while you think he might be able to turn the tables and usurp main villain status. But his failure to do so only enhances our main antagonist, Kuja. Kuja is a fantastic villain. His flamboyant design is a perfect extension of his personality. He loves to troll and make others uncomfortable with his presence as a display of power. Don't mind me, I'm just gonna walk around in a thong because I don't give a damn. He's an egotistical narcissist, believing himself to be a superior being to all other living creatures, and he is insulted by the idea of his mortality. He's like Xand in that way, but far better executed. The final boss of the game, Necron, is thematically coherent given the game's themes of life and death, but his presence isn't hinted enough in the game's text. He's a great final boss with a great design, and seems mostly to serve as a buffer between the battle with Kuja and the ending, so there's some chance of minor redemption for Kuja, even if it's just Zidane acknowledging their shared humanity. Or Geomedy? Kuja is a great villain, and even the final boss Out of Nowhere twist doesn't hurt him in these overall rankings. He's one of the best in the series and is worthy of the number 5 spot. Number 4, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X arguably has 3 main villains, a trinity of sorts. One villain is Seymour, and by extension the Church of Yevon. Another is Sin, the force of nature that is also Jet, our lead's father. And then there is Yu Yevon, the force behind the scenes that is ultimately the cause of all the conflict, a demiurge needing to be destroyed so humanity can be freed from its yoke. Seymour is more your traditional flashy Final Fantasy villain with his over-the-top design and general creepy vibes. He chews the scenery and works as a great human antagonist for the heroes to face over the course of the game. The cast is able to exchange indirect dialogue with him and debate ideals where it's not possible with the mostly beastly and abstract presences of the other villains, at least for the bulk of the story. Seymour acting as a figure representing the corrupt nature of political and religious institutions is great thematically and could have easily served as a satisfying final boss. Sin, a force of nature, a kaiju monster that acts more like a hurricane than a crafty mastermind, is more symbolic of the struggle of man against nature. However, Sin is also Jet, Tidus' father, and thus he allows for the ancient tale of the son needing to kill the father to become his own man. It's a classic heroic metaphor, usually meant in a more abstract way in terms of defining identity, but in Final Fantasy X it becomes far more literal. Tidus hates his father for being drunk and abusive, and he ultimately needs to face his father, his past, in order to become his true self, even if it means the erasure of the only existence he's ever known. He kills his father, but it is because his father wants to be killed, because in spite of his flaws he loves his son, and wants his son to go beyond him. Tidus kills his father, and in doing so, he finally forgives his father, and in turn, forgives himself for his role in his past as well. Then there's Yu Yevon, the twist villain that comes out at the end, but there's far greater setup for Yu Yevon than the other twist final bosses in the series. And the corrupting demiurge fits in perfectly with the lore and themes that have been set up and built upon throughout the game's narrative. Together, this trinity of villains are strong enough to elevate Final Fantasy X to the number 4 spot on this list. Number 3, Final Fantasy VI. Look, I can talk about how Emperor Gestal is a fine fake-out villain. I can talk about how General Leo is a great antagonist because of his sense of honor, being a great way to showcase that good people can be on the opposing side in military conflicts. And I can talk about how hilarious Ultros is, and how he is probably the best comic relief villain in the series. But these characters aren't why Final Fantasy VI is so high in the villain ranking. It's because of Kefka. I'll be the first to admit I'm more mixed on Final Fantasy VI than most of the community. I have a lot of issues with the game, but Kefka isn't one of them. Kefka, simply put, is one of the greatest villains in video game history. He's basically the Joker, but with magic powers, so infinitely more dangerous. He's vile and cruel. Few villains get as much sheer joy out of murder and destruction as Kefka, and few villains hate happiness and hope as much as he does. He's both hilarious and terrifying, and is a great embodiment of nihilism, which serves as a fantastic counter to the themes of our hopeful heroes fighting through their hardships in spite of how bleak things may become. Kefka destroyed the world and became an all-powerful god. He's one of the few villains in the series who actually succeeded with his evil plan. But with all of that said, I think there is another villain who succeeded in his goal that's ultimately better. Number 2, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV gets a lot of flack from fans, but even the harshest critics of the game tend to concede that Ardyn Izunia is one of the greatest villains in the Final Fantasy series. While most of the villains in the Empire generally feel like they got shortchanged due to the massive story cuts the finished game received, Ardyn manages to feel fully realized without any issue. His design is fantastic. The voice acting for him is top-notch. He's a scene stealer with great character motivation and fascinating lore behind his backstory. Ardyn was once destined to be the one chosen king, but a plague called the Star Scourge began to infect his people. Ardyn was able to absorb the darkness into his own body, healing the sick and innocent. But in his selfless act, the Star Scourge corrupted his body, and the gods rejected his place as the one true king. His brother betrayed him, usurping the throne and chaining the immortal Ardyn like the Norse god Loki to be tormented for all of eternity. When he finally escapes his shackles, Ardyn vows revenge on the royal line and seeks to end it once and for all. His arc from tragic hero to villain is fantastic. Ardyn succeeds in creating a world of darkness and ruin like Kefka, but he also achieves his much more personal goal of ending the royal line of Lucius with the death of the royal family. The personal spite in Ardyn's arc makes his achievement of his villainous ends feel much more palpable and visceral than Kefka's simple desire to destroy all of existence just cuz. Final Fantasy XV may be flawed, but Ardyn is an example of one of the game's greatest strengths, and is one of the greatest villains in Final Fantasy history. Number 1, Final Fantasy VII. There is often debate over who the single best Final Fantasy villain is. Most of the debate comes down between two figures, Kefka and Sephiroth. Obviously with 7 ranking number 1 here, you know which of these two I prefer. But before I talk about Sephiroth, I think it's important to talk about the other villains of Final Fantasy VII, because they are plenty great. President Shinra acts as a great initial antagonist. The Shinra Corporation itself is an embodiment of corporate fascism. With his death and a successor immediately replacing him in the form of his son Rufus, we see that the institutional structure is not so easily changed by simply removing a figurehead, and that larger societal change is needed. While thematically that is great stuff, it's worth noting how much personality both the Shinra father and son have, as they're both truly captivating on screen. The Turks and Don Corneo serve as great comic relief villains to help alleviate some of the pressures of the story. The familiar presence they offer is somewhat comforting to the player, as it's better to run into them than somebody else. And then we have Hojo, possibly the most evil character in the entire Final Fantasy series. He's basically an Axis powers mad scientist and is about as vile as you can be. Without his corrupting influence, Sephiroth, his son, never would have come to be. He created a monster, but Shinra in their lust for power enabled his creation of a monster. Like blowback in a war, the unintended consequences of a lust for power and resources can lead to the creation of a powerful destructive force. Sephiroth, infused with the cells of the alien parasite Genova, is a fantastic villain. While he may have been an incredibly powerful war hero, prior to discovering the secret of his genetics, he was actually a pretty chill guy. But finding out he was essentially nothing more than a monster broke his brain. He went insane when confronted with the true nature of his existence, and decided he wanted to become a god. Sephiroth has a great, striking design and incredible presence on screen. Every time he's on screen, he steals the show, and even when he's not on screen, his presence lingers over the party like a dark shadow. Whether it be the trail of blood in Shinra HQ, his sword in President Shinra's back, or the impaled Midgar serpent, his power and presence is continually overwhelming. As much as I like Kefka, sometimes when he's on screen, he's just kinda there. That's never the case with Sephiroth. Attention always diverts to him, no matter what, even if he's not actively on screen. He is the shark from Jaws. He is the force of nature, the most iconic villain in the series. It is because of him that the planet unleashes the giant monsters known as Weapon as a defense against him. He is the cause of the meteor crashing down upon the planet. He is the cause of the most famous death in gaming history. He has a strong, menacing, terrifying personality, and he exudes power. His Oedipal relationship with his corrupt alien mother Genova is fully disturbing. Genova, the alien force corrupting the planet, is a primal villain that strikes at the core of the human soul. Whether it be Lavos, Deus, or the Demiurge, for centuries human beings have sensed some sort of alien presence that wants to consume and destroy humanity. And the fact that Sephiroth treats such a being as his divine mother only enhances his descent into becoming more and more inhuman. In Sephiroth, we see how a man can become a monster, and this monster goes and destroys everything Cloud cares for. He breaks Cloud in body and in spirit. And yet Cloud is able to overcome this unstoppable force. In defeating Sephiroth, we learn how we can overcome our darkness and the most insurmountable odds, just as Cloud did. As I said before, Sephiroth is the most iconic villain in the series. We all know that most iconic doesn't automatically equate to best. But with his strong personality, great design, enhancement of the narrative's themes, relationship with the cast, and role in the plot, Sephiroth elevates to the #1 spot. The best Final Fantasy villain. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!